Hi everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today we are going to compare the difference between a single packet of Kool-Aid and this big hunkin' tub of Kool-Aid. Now, the big difference between the two is that this little packet has no sugar in it yet. So you can add sweetener on your own, which is why it's a tiny packet for, I guess, 5 servings is what this particular one says, that it'll make 5 servings. Now, this tub already has sugar mixed in, so the food coloring itself is a lot more diluted, and there's recipes for, I guess, 3/4 of a scoop makes 1 serving of the Kool-Aid. So a much larger scoop of this mixture makes 1 serving of Kool-Aid. Now, in a live stream in the past, we looked at the difference between these, and I think there were many, many scoops of this to be equivalent to 1 packet. This gave some more dilute colors with speckling, but I wanted to show this in a standalone video so that way you guys had this information. Because I know that KoolAid packets can sometimes be hard to find, and it might be easier to find these tubs. But I want to start this video by saying, economically, it makes more sense to get these 25 to 33 cent packets than pay multiple dollars for one of these huge tubs, because ultimately it does not have the same value in terms of the total amount of food coloring when it comes to dyeing yarn. I would like to give a huge shout out and thank you to today's lab partner, Virginia Tracy. Virginia, thank you so much for supporting this episode of Dyepot Weekly. I am really excited to dive into this little experiment and compare these 2 forms of cherry Kool-Aid. Now, in order to dye yarn with food coloring, you need to make sure that you have food coloring, which we've got. You need acid. There's citric acid in both of these containers, so you don't need to add any additional acid. And you'll need heat, which we'll do on the stovetop. And finally, you need to make sure you pick the right yarn. Today, I will start off by dyeing some Knit Picks Wool of the Andes worsted weight yarn. This yarn is 100% Peruvian Highland wool. We might use some other skeins at the end of the video as well, but I'll share what those are at the time. Unfortunately, you cannot dye synthetic yarn or cotton or other cellulose fibers with food coloring. You need to have a protein-based fiber like wool, alpaca, silk. Things that won't work include cotton, linen, acrylic, and polyester. But you can dye blends with wool and those other items. I started off dyeing 80% acrylic, 20% wool with Kool-Aid when I started my own yarn dyeing adventure. So blends do work, but for the most pigmented results, I recommend 100% wool or a superwash wool nylon blend or something like that. I am pre-soaking the yarn in some plain tap water for at least 30 minutes before we dye it. When dealing with food-safe dye like Kool-Aid, I am personally comfortable using the same pots and pans for dyeing the yarn that I might use for cooking. But please, if you're ever going to use a commercial dye, make sure you have dedicated dye equipment. But I love to use food coloring to dye yarn with my kids, and it is a lot of fun, and as you'll see, we can get some beautiful pigmented colors. Cherry Kool-Aid is one of the most pigmented Kool-Aid colors, and that is why I have picked it today. You could also probably do a comparison between grape, and I think I have some blue raspberry lemonade if you would like. The first ingredient in these Kool-Aid packets is citric acid, which is perfect as the acid source to dye our yarn. And we also have red 40 in here. You need to use artificial food coloring for this to work. In the US, that'll be red 3, red 40, blue 1, yellow 5, and yellow 6 as the most commonly found artificial food coloring molecules. If you don't want to stain your fingers, I recommend wearing gloves, but you also don't have to. So let's take a look at 1 packet of cherry Kool-Aid. We're going to look at the color and at our volume here. So 1 packet of cherry Kool-Aid is probably less than half of 1 tablespoon of volume. The color of this powder is a very deep color. You can tell by looking at that there's a lot of pigment there. With a full scoop of the sugar mixture, you can immediately see the difference. there is some pigmentation in here. You almost see speckles within that sugar that is the pigment. And I am just curious for a rough measure. 1 scoop is 1, 2, I guess about 3 tablespoons of volume. Now, the sugar itself is not really a concern. Sugar is very, very soluble in water, so you can easily rinse it out of the yarn. It is more convenient not to have sugar in there, but when you're paying for that big tub, you are mostly paying, I think, for the sugar. It has weight, you need a bigger container, all those things go into the price when what we care about is the pigment and the citric acid. Looking at the ingredients of this tub, the first ingredient is sugar, followed by fructose, which is also a sugar, then citric acid. But if you go down, we'll see the same red 40 for our artificial food coloring. In each of these pots, we have 8 cups of water, and I'm gonna turn them on to the stove on to start heating things up. I'm gonna add our full packet of cherry Kool-Aid to the one in back, and we will rinse the powder out of this bowl. Normally I don't add the powder to a bowl or anything first, but I wanted to do that today just to show the visual difference between the powders starting off and to show the respective volumes, because this packet of Kool-Aid said that it was 5 servings, and granted, with our sugary mixture, we had a lot more volume of stuff here, but it's I think 3/4 of a scoop, or so about 3/4 of the total amount we're adding is 1 serving. So we know that this is going to be less pigmented, and even though we're in a lighter jar, I think you can already just tell that it's less pigmented. But once things heat up, or actually, let's add the yarn now. First, I'm going to add the yarn. I just wrung out this pre-soaked yarn. This is to our sugary mix. And there's still, I'm not really going for dip dyeing, except I just want to be able to add all the yarn in. Probably should have grabbed a spoon, but this is ultimately not that pigmented, so I'm not worried about the color on my hands. I think on the monitor, it is looking a lot more orange. Actually, in person, it looks a little bit coral, but on the monitor, the color definitely feels more yellow than the pink, pinkish coral I see in person. Okay, now for our other, and can you see the difference already? Since it's in a more awkward spot on the stove, I am just going to stir. So it is also looking fairly pink, but clearly, even now, just looking at the yarn, and sorry, the colors are off on the camera, there is just a lot more pigment on this skein right here. So I'm now going to slowly heat these up and let them heat until the color has all absorbed. Now, color absorbs to non-superwash wool a little bit slower than it will to superwash. So we'll check back in about 30 minutes, but I'll make sure that if things start to bubble too much, I will reduce the temperature, I'll reduce the heat, because we don't want to risk any felting, but I don't expect it to be a problem today. Finally, if this has 5 servings per container, and this big tub is 3/4 of a scoop for 1 serving, if we did 4 scoops, so that would be 12 tablespoons of this container. That might be roughly equivalent to what is in the packet. Now, I am now wondering if there is a bit of a difference between some of the KoolAid packets like this one that are newer and some that I have that are older. I was surprised seeing that there were only 5 servings, and so this packet, which is best by August 2020, and right now it's August 2020, this says it has 8 servings in here. And this packet that is closer to the one that I used today. It says that it has 5 servings. Now, the two of these have the exact same amount of weight. I think that what happened is that they swapped their serving size from 8 ounces to 12 ounces to make something a bit more realistic. This is my hypothesis, because this one doesn't mention a serving size, the one that I used today, but our big container here does say a 12-ounce serving. So now the question is, should we go bigger? Maybe not. Let's go off of the information on here on the modern packet. 4 full scoops that we just put in here is a little bit over 5 servings. So yeah, we'll see how that color compares to the one packet. But we'll do that with fresh water after we have finished the experiments currently on the stovetop. The 30 minutes are up, and can you tell the difference? The water might still have a tinge of color here from our sugary sample, but let's check our full packet, which isn't really a true red. Oh, that looks clear to me. This isn't a true red per se, but it is a very like strawberry pink. It's definitely much more pigmented. So I've turned off the heat. I'm gonna let the yarn sit in these pots for a bit to cool. If you notice that your yarn isn't absorbing color fast enough, you can go ahead and add some acid, but it shouldn't be necessary, and I'm not going to do that yet. We'll peek back after it's cooled off a little bit. The pot is still a little warm, but you can see that the yarn, or that the dye bath has completely cleared. So I'm gonna set this aside and add fresh water to our pot so we can dye the 3rd skein. Fresh 8 cups of water here, and just look at the volume that we are gonna be adding in. And I'm gonna slowly sprinkle this into our pot, and we are a lot pigmented with 4 times as much dye as what we used previously. So I'm going to stir this to make sure that the Kool-Aid is well dissolved. I now want to note that this is mixed at approximately full strength. If you need 3/4 of a scoop in 12 ounces of water, and there's about 64 ounces of water in here, yeah, it's semi-reasonable. But immediately, as I add our yarn in, and did I label this? Okay, I did not label this zip tie, but I labeled the other zip ties. I'll label this one in a moment. But immediately, I can tell that this is a more saturated color than what we had before. Now, it is looking more orange to me, but the color that we just removed isn't very orange, it is more pink. So it could just be the way that the light is hitting it, but it's hard to say if it's actually going to be about the same color. It's just read 40 in there, so I think that it'll heat up and we will see where we are in 30 minutes. Finally, I wanted to evaluate how the concentrated Kool-Aid packet versus our sugar mixture speckle on yarn. This is also something we evaluated in a past live stream, but I thought that the demonstration and comparison would be really useful. Starting with our huge tub, I, with my fingers, started sprinkling this powder lightly, maybe heavier in some patches, onto a pre-soaked skein of bare Knit Picks Stroll Fingering Weight yarn. This yarn is 75% superwash merino, 25% nylon, and if you want speckles to show up sharper on yarn, you really want to use a superwash wool versus the non-superwash that we were using before. Now, I started with the tub because I knew it was going to be less pigmented and that the speckles themselves would be a little bit lighter in color from my past experience with this. But then next I took a second skein of Stroll and our packet of Kool-Aid and went ahead and again speckled with my fingers on that. And now let's zoom in so we can compare the two. The first thing I want to note is I went heavy. I was taking big pinches of that powder and sprinkling it on. And what I have all over is some fine speckles, although maybe that's just some stuff that hasn't dissolved yet, but then a more wash of color. Whereas here, we get some wash of color, but we get heavier speckles, especially when I don't move it right away. I'm actually a little perplexed that my speckles aren't as sharp as I normally see, but let's zoom in. Here are some fresh speckles from our KoolAid packet, and even coming in here, just adding some powder on, you can see that there is a level of pigmentation right away. There will be a little bit of spread that I've been seeing today, but we get that really, really sharp color. And coming back to that same region, if I don't move the yarn around as much, you can see those sharper speckles. With our sugary mix, there's some areas where it looks like we've got some good speckles, but some of that is still stuff that hasn't sunk in. Let's go to a bare area and then heavily, you can see that sugar go down. And there might be some speckles in there, some areas that are a bit more pigmented. But a lot of those more dilute things give us that lighter wash of color. So as you see that go in, there are some really pastel specks, which when you go heavy gives you a lighter wash of color, and then a few sparse darker ones. So while you can get speckles with both, zooming out, and we've got our sugar mix here and the packet right here, you could see even from far away, if you're not looking at the really close-up scale, you can see those individual spots where I added the color way more clearly than you do over here. And we could add more color if you really want your speckles to be super, super sharp. I recommend going and maybe even starting with the yarn a little bit warm, but still not very wet. But I think what I'm gonna do now is we're gonna go steam set all of this yarn in the microwave. So I have a microwave safe dish. I'm going to take my yarn, place it in our bowl, then we're gonna cover it. You can use plastic wrap or a cover, and then I'm gonna microwave this on high in 2-minute increments for a total of 4 minutes. The reason for doing the short increments is that way I can check in between and make sure I'm not overheating the yarn. Then we will let the yarn cool slowly before we wash it. One other note, food coloring can stain, so I did protect my work surface with a layer of plastic wrap before coming in and speckling. And now I'm gonna do the same thing with our other skein in a fresh bowl. Oh, and I didn't point this out before, the Rogue Blue Speckle. This is a pale blue, not as dark as we've seen sometimes, but there is blue number 1 in those KoolAid packets, which could account for some of the differences in hues maybe, but I'll check and see if blue 1 is also in the tub. But I wasn't using any like blue KoolAid or anything, so yeah, it must have come from the packet, I think. The container does not have blue 1. And there is the blue 1 with our red 40 on our packet. All right, it's been a half an hour and I am going to turn off the heat. Let's check in on the color. And I'm also still seeing a tiny bit of pink left, but sometimes moving the yarn and just removing it and putting it back in might help. We've got more acid in here this time because of the greater amount of KoolAid we added to our pot. Yeah, I'm expecting it all to absorb in a little bit. And as for the depth of the color, it's pretty similar. We'll need to compare when dry and see if the hues look at all different, but I'm gonna set this aside and we're gonna do one last skein because we have a little bit of leftover dye. This is the pot that had 1 packet of KoolAid previously, and we're now gonna add the rest of that packet that we used for speckling, rinsing out the rest of the powder from this bowl. I always worry about Rogue powder sort of ending up places because it is so pigmented. While we're at it, we're gonna come in with the remainder of this. I don't know if it was close to a whole scoop that we had aliquoted, but the difference between what's residually in the container when we rinse out the bowls is pretty apparent. And stir things up to make sure things are well dissolved. This is still warm. It has not yet cooled off. And I'm now gonna bring in our yarn and we're gonna just dip dye it. You could save the packet of cherry Kool-Aid to use for future speckling project, but if moisture gets introduced into the powder, then it starts to clump and be less usable. But I'm dip dyeing a skein of Knit Pick Stroll fingering weight yarn to create a repeating, more subtle ombre colorway. On socks, you might end up with something that feels like micro stripes from a dip dyed colorway like this, or depending on how much yarn and how like fast or slow you dip the color in, you could also end up with something that feels more of a spiral, which is something else that I've seen. But I'm trying to get some last little bit of color, but the balance here, there's a lot more of the deep compared to the paler, and oh man, sorry, the color balance is not reading well, but I see like a nice baby pink to more red in there through the dip dyeing. And you can see just how quickly these colors did strike. Things strike faster on superwash yarn, but with more acid, because we added another packet of Kool-Aid and a scoop of our drink mix, that adds to the pigmentation here. So I am going to heat this for about 15 minutes, turn off the heat, let everything cool, and then we'll go and wash the yarn all together. Let's start washing our first two skeins, and we've got some sunlight, but there is absolutely a color difference, although it is fairly subtle. I'm gonna add some clear dish soap into our wash bath, mainly because of the sugar, and so therefore I'm gonna wanna rinse it multiple times. So right now I just wanted to show you that the rinse is completely clear. Now, since this yarn is not superwash, I do want to take care with the amount of agitation, etc. But I'm going to go ahead and finish rinsing this off camera. I'm going to then put my yarn through a spin dryer to remove liquid, hang it to dry, and let's go check on the speckled yarn. We are going to wash our speckled yarn in the same way. I think first impressions, and I did label one of the zip ties, is that you can get speckling. Oh, you can't really see because of the sun. I think my first impression is that you can get speckling both ways, but if you really want to get speckles, you want your powder to be as concentrated as possible. That being said, you don't need Kool-Aid to do speckles with food coloring. Check out my videos making DIY sugar sprinkles with liquid food coloring and gel food coloring, actually. I know that video is out already. And that works great for getting really pigmented custom colors of sprinkles on yarn. But anyway, there's no bleeding. I wasn't expecting any, but no bleeding. I'm gonna rinse this a few more times and also put it through my spin dryer. And then the rest of the yarn I'm gonna go ahead and wash off camera, so we can then come back and look at all 6 skeins that we dyed in this video with various kinds of cherry Kool-Aid. Here is all of the yarn that we dyed with our KoolAid packets and our large tub. And now let's go in and take a closer look at these comparisons. When it comes to speckling, you can speckle with both, but you don't get as many speckles when you have the sugared tub. You end up with a lot more of a pastel pink wash with the occasional speckles. With the KoolAid packets, you are able to get a light wash of color, but you're also able to get more sharp points and speckles on the yarn itself. If we were to zoom out on our packet versus tub, I went really heavy in here with the powder, and I applied a lot of powder to get this level of speckling. And here I used very little of the KoolAid packet, like a tiny amount. And in places where it's heavier, you can see and get a feel for the yarn zoomed out versus just zooming in on the two. So You can speckle with both. I prefer using the packet, but you could dilute it with some sugar yourself if you wanted to spread things out some more, which would be much more cost effective than getting the tub. Next, we have our more tonals that we did on our non-superwash wool. We have 1 scoop of our sugar tub mixture, 1 packet of cherry Kool-Aid, and then we've got 4 scoops of the cherry mixture. And this is fairly interesting to me because I feel like this is our most pigmented color. The differences are fairly subtle. There's no question that 1 packet of Kool-Aid, which is less than 1 tablespoon, is more pigmented than 1 scoop, which I think is 3 tablespoons of that Kool-Aid sugar powder. And you could see the difference in the color of the actual powders itself, so these differences made sense. I am not sure if you mixed a picture from each of them, like how similar things would feel, but I do know, well, these 3 skeins work super, super well together, which is fun. And I think this, again, goes back to the cost. 1 packet of cherry Kool-Aid is between 25 and 33 cents if I find them at the supermarket. 1 tub of Kool-Aid is, you know, a couple dollars, but I don't think you have the same equivalent serving wise into the packets. This small canister was $3.50 and it has a total of 32 servings. It's talking about 8-ounce servings versus the 12-ounce servings that the other container has. But say that there's only 5 servings to 1 packet of Kool-Aid, then this would be equivalent of 6 packets of Kool-Aid, which would be between $1 to $2, depending on the price of the packets. So this takes up more space, it's heavier, you don't get as much pigmentation with the powder, it's just more expensive. The reason why I don't have the cost of the big tub is because I ordered through Amazon Fresh a size like this, and they sent me the huge one, probably because they didn't have any more, so they sent me a substitution of a bigger one, so I don't have the actual cost of what I paid for the big tub. Finally, we had some dye left over, and in an effort to use up all of our dye, we created the following dip dyed skein, which is fun and pretty. Ultimately, my recommendations come down to the cost. And if you cannot find the little Kool-Aid packets, I completely, wholeheartedly recommend that you go for liquid food coloring drops. I think that you get more pigmentation for your dollar anyway if you go straight for liquid food coloring versus Kool-Aid, but you can certainly use the sugary mixes. There's nothing to stop you. It all depends on if the costs and techniques are worth it to you. But in my opinion, I think that the tiny Kool-Aid packets for Kool-Aid give the most versatility for a powdered beverage versus the tubs. But that is just my opinion. Which do you prefer? What do you like best? Let me know down in the comments below. Virginia Tracy, thank you so much for being today's Dyepot Weekly Lab Partner. I really hope you enjoyed the video, and I can't wait to pick which skein of sock yarn I'm gonna send you. I really hope you love it. If you would like to learn more how you as a viewer can become a Dyepot Weekly Lab Partner, go and check out the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. You can find details in the listings there. And if there aren't currently any slots available, feel free to message me on Etsy and I can put you on the waiting list to notify when new slots become available. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel. I release at least 2 new videos every single week, and I love to play with a combination of food coloring and commercial dyes and play around with different techniques and comparisons. Sometimes I like to say that I take risks so that way you don't have to, and hopefully my videos will help you decide where you might want to start or the tweaks you may want to make for your own dyeing journey. I don't have plans currently to do a deep dive into the packet versus the tub for a couple other flavors that I happen to have both of. But if this is something that you would really like to see, please let me know down in the comments. If you love the yarn I dye and would like to bring some home and support the content here on the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel at the same time, go and check out the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. The shop is filled with over 100 skeins of hand-dyed yarn featured in my videos. And as I said, it's a really, really great way to support the content here at the same time. And thank you so much for watching.